Given the unenviable task of, like all the other reviewers, of summing up one subject in 30 minutes, and the subject that I was given is to review theory and observations of debris disk, which sounds like two subjects to me. So I gave it one focus, which is to talk on what debris disks tell us about planetary systems. Because as Sasha Krivov's review said, when we look at debris disks, we're seeing dust, but thinking planets. Those are, for most of us, the most interesting thing about debris disks is what they tell us about planetary systems. Okay, so the Scientific Organizing Committee have given us a great meeting that's had lots of debris disks already, so they don't need a huge introduction. Most of you already have seen several debris disks in this meeting already. So this is so just a quick summary of what they are. So debris disks are the dust disks found around main sequence stars. They're almost exclusively found by looking at photometry of the star, and you look for, this is the spectrum of the star Fomalhaut, this is the star here, and if you do photometry and see that there's more emission than you expect from the star, that comes from the debris disk. It's thermal emission from dust around the star that's been heated by the star. And they're almost exclusively found in the far infrared by IRAS, Spitzer, or Herschel, and then follow-up is done at other wavelengths to get the shape of this spectrum. And for those that are near enough to us and bright enough, the lucky ones, and we can image them as well. This is an image of the Fomalhaut disk taken with Herschel. And it shows that the dust is in a ring that's at about 130 AU in radius from the star. And a similar thing is seen for the other disks, although Fomalhaut is a particularly spectacular example. So there are a couple of ways of thinking of debris disks. Well, there are two, one of which is more instructive than the other. So we've heard a lot about protoplanetary disks already in this meeting. So it's helpful to start off by pointing out the ways in which debris disks are different to protoplanetary disks. There's some quite important differences. So first of all, there's age. So as I said, debris disks are found around around main sequence stars. Protoplanetary disks are found around young stars. This isn't exclusive, though. As you remember from Neil Evans' talk, he found in his DIGIT survey several young stars that have what he called were debris disks. Why did he call those debris disks? Well, I don't know exactly, because there's no industry standard definition that says what defines a debris disk compared to a protoplanetary disk, but most people will agree that it's to do with the level of dust. So a protoplanetary disk is optically thick, which is why Gaspar could use these disks as natural coronagraphs to see them when they're edge on. Debris disks are optically thin, which is why we had to use a man-made coronagraph to image this. And this translates into the dust mass as well. There's a lot more mass in protoplanetary disks, as John Carpenter was telling us, and debris disks have a lot less mass, one order of magnitude at least less dust mass than a protoplanetary disk. And Wayne Holland has a poster on submillimeter observations that measure dust mass of debris disks that you can go and see for that. There's also a difference in the gas. Protoplanetary disks have a lot of gas. Debris disks don't usually. Some of them do, and I'll show some more on that later. The structures are usually different, but then again there are some similarities. Debris disks typically have these large inner holes. Protoplanetary disks would say usually don't, but then you have the transition disks. The often quoted physical difference between the two of them is that in debris disks, the dust that we see has to be secondary. It has to be created from the breakup of planetesimals because it has a short lifetime, whereas protoplanetary disks, that dust can be sticking together and growing, and it could in fact be primordial. This is a good conceptual difference between the two, but it's almost impossible to tell observationally, and it's not really clear that you can't have debris dust in protoplanetary disks anyway. So I think this is certainly a useful background to debris disks, but the best way of thinking of a debris disk is as a component of a planetary system. So if you look at the solar system's debris disk, it's made up of the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt. And if you look at the structure of the Kuiper belt, it's certainly telling us something about the solar system's protoplanetary disk, but it's more indicative, more directly illustrative of the architecture of the planets in the solar system. To make that point more clearly, if you look at the lifetime, how long planetesimals would survive as a function of their distance in the solar system, then everywhere in the inner solar system, this is the outer solar system going from Jupiter out to the Kuiper belt here, this lifetime is very short. It's around 1 million years or so, and the only places in the solar system where the lifetime gets up to 4.5 billion years, so things can remain for the lifetime of the solar system, is in the Kuiper belt, and also, if we carried this plot inwards, in the asteroid belt as well. And this is well known theoretically, because we know that planets overlapping resonances carve gaps, these blue gaps here, but then because this is a multi-planet system, this region of chaos actually extends between outside those regions as well. So at least in the solar system, the location of the debris traces regions of dynamical stability in the solar system. So perhaps the same is true in extrasolar debris disks. Well, if we look at the systems that have multiple planets and debris, this is a plot from Amaya Moro-Martin a few years ago. We see the star here, the blue dots are the planets, these bars are the location of the debris. We don't know exactly where the debris is because it's usually estimated from the temperature. We don't know all of the planets, but it's certainly suggestive that in these systems there's debris and in the gaps there's planets. Of course, this is a self-selecting sample in some cases, in some senses, and there are also systems that have debris that have no known planets yet. And it brings up the question of what should our null hypothesis be when we're looking at debris disks? Should it be that all debris disks have planets inside them? Well, that of course is ridiculous to say that there have to be planets there. But it's equally uninformative to have a null hypothesis that there are no planets there, because it's virtually impossible to prove unless you go out and really show that there aren't any planets that you can image or find by any other means. So what people do is to stick with what we can say for sure. And what we know for sure is that if there are planets near debris disks, then it is inevitable that they will impose dynamical structure on those disks. And so we can use observed structures of disks and compare them to the structures that we know are inevitable if there are planets in the disks to set constraints on the planets that are there, should they exist. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there may be a non-planet explanation for anything that we see. So I'm going to go through first of all, a few of the structures that planets can impose on disks. Most of this is by relation to direct imaging, in the realm of direct imaging. So if we want to look at structures, we need to have high-resolution images. And the first one is the shape of the inner edge. It was pointed out, first of all, by Alice Quillen that if we've got planets carving a hole at in these disks, then the outermost planet in that system will shape the structure of the inner edge. And Eugene Chiang followed this up later on. They were both trying to explain the shape of the Fomalhaut disk's inner edge, and at the time this was actually the strongest constraint on the mass of Fomalhaut B. Up until a couple of days ago, when Paul told us that Fomalhaut B isn't actually shaping the inner edge of this disk, at which point these constraints are actually on hypothetical Fomalhaut C, which is orbiting in the inner edge, because it is inevitable that if there is a planet at the inner edge, the planet is here, then the shape of this inner edge depends on the planet's mass. So that if the planet is low mass, then it has a sharp edge. If it is high mass, then it has a shallow edge. And the offset of the edge from the planet is also set by the planet's mass. So Fomalhaut used to be, in my mind, the best example of a planet, the properties of which have been predicted from observations and then found in direct imaging. Of course, it's now lost that title, and that title now goes to Beta Pic, which has a planet that was inferred from these observations of its disk. Its disk is seen edge on, and the disk is seen to be warped. So the plane of symmetry of the disk is along the x-axis here, out in the outer regions, but in the inner regions, then there's this warp that you see there. And this is exactly what you expect if there's a planet in the disk that is that was started off misaligned from the disk. Because what the planet does is it acts to align the orbits of everything in the disk with its own orbit. But it does that much faster for material that is nearby to it. So because beta Pic is young, then you see material in the inner disk that's aligned with the planet's orbit, but material in the outer disk which remains unperturbed for now. And Jean-Charles Augereau did a nice model of the images and showed that the structure is consistent with a planet that's around 10 Jupiter mass at around 10 AU and fits very nicely with the planet that was later found by Anne-Marie Lagrange, and which we heard about in the talk yesterday. So I think at the moment, the orbit of the planet isn't perfectly known. So at the moment, there still could be some possibility for it to disappear the way of Fomalhaut B and to not be the planet causing the structure. But at the moment, it looks like everything is consistent. And Anne-Marie has a poster on the constraints on the orbits, and she can talk to her more about. Okay, so that's what you get for an inclined planet. If you put a planet in a disk and it's on an eccentric orbit, then rather than aligning the orbital planes with the planet aligns the eccentricities with its orbit. It imposes an eccentricity on a disk and a pericenter orientation. And again, it does that faster for material that's closer to the planet. And this causes rather than a warp to propagate out through the disk, it causes a tightly wound spiral structure to propagate out, fairly similar to the one that's seen around HD 141569. But on long time scales, what this does is it causes the disk to be eccentric. And if the disk is not a broad disk but a ring, then what you end up with is an eccentric ring. And this causes two effects. This causes, first of all, an offset. So the center of symmetry of this ring is offset from the star. And this is actually quite a common feature. And I haven't shown any examples up here. There are actually, it all looks a bit fuzzy down here, but there's a bunch of people have talked about this, and there are some posters by Chris Dark and Farams, which you could go and see to find more information about eccentric rings with offsets. That offset can also be manifested in observation as a brightness asymmetry, because one side of the ring would be closer to the star and so brighter, and that's what's seen in HR 4796. Okay, so the last structure I'll talk about coming from planets is clumps in disks. So this has a bit of a checkered history. So these are the images of Epsilon Eridani's disk and Vega taken with Scuba. These are, by eye, obviously clumpy, but the controversy comes because when these disks are observed with interferometry, these clumps haven't been confirmed, or rather they have been confirmed and then they've not been confirmed. So there's a bit of backwards and forwards on this. So there are new observations of both of these disks that Wayne Holland can tell you about in his poster. And I think what we need to do, Meredith is here as well. We should get Wayne and Meredith to fight it out and tell us whether these clumps are real and to figure out what's going on. But one disk that does have clumps for which are not in controversy is beta Pic. This is the mid-infrared image of the disk. This is about the location of the warp, actually, and if you want to get an idea of the extent, this is 50 AU here. This side of the disk is brighter than this side. This was first seen by Lagrange and Pantin, and then Charlie Telesco imaged this disk in great detail and interpreted this asymmetry as a symmetrical disk with this clump sitting inside it. Now the problem, so the asymmetry is not controversial, but whether this is a clump or not probably is, because this is an edge-on disk. Of course, we're seeing this clump in projection. That's about to change, not because beta Pic is about to flip on its side, but because we can flip it on its side, because we can observe it in a different way. So there are now images of beta Pic in CO. Now CO is not typically seen towards debris disks, and there's a good reason for that, because CO has a lifetime of just 100 years due to photodissociation from the interstellar radiation field. We see it in protoplanetary disks because these are optically thick, but debris disks are optically thin, so we don't typically expect to see it. There are a couple of disks that have CO. It's thought to be because of this short lifetime, it has to be continually replenished. from the breakup of planetesimals. But beta-pic wasn't one that was known to have CO in emission. It was in absorption, but not in emission. So it was surprising when Bill Dent took this image with ALMA and showed not only was there a detection of CO, but there's an image of CO, a very high signal to noise. Shows the power of ALMA. And we can see this image shows the midplane of the disk. It's got high resolution. It's about 10 AU resolution. And we also see this clump. The clump that we saw in the mid-infrared turns up at very high at high contrast here in the CO image. But what's even better with CO is this isn't just a two-dimensional image. Each point on this image also has velocity information. As Sean Andrews was saying in his talk, we can exploit the velocity field from these observations. So one way of plotting this is to show a position velocity diagram. So I'm going to show the velocity of the CO at different points along the disk. So this is the position velocity diagram. So for example, at 50 AU in the disk, the CO is moving towards us at this range of velocities. This is a range of velocities that you'd expect for CO that's in Keplerian orbit between 60 AU and 130 AU. Now this whole, it always gives me a headache to look at this plot and have to scratch my head to think about what it actually means in terms of the structure of the disk. But then I realized that actually each point in this plot, if you assume that it's on Keplerian rotation, corresponds to a unique point in the disk. Well, not a unique point. There's 2 points in the disk that it can correspond to. So we can actually reproject this observation and see what the disk looks like face on. So this is what beta-pic could look like face on in one of these reprojections. We're looking up here in the disk. The disk is rotating around in the clockwise direction, and we have a clump of CO here with a tail, fainter tail extending behind it, and another clump on this side over here as well. Okay, so what could these clumps be? Well, there are two explanations in the literature. One of these is to do with resonances. So a planet could have migrated outwards through the disk, not beta-pic B, but a hypothetical beta-pic C. And hopefully these movies are going to work. Maybe, yeah. So if a planet starts here and then migrates outwards through the disk, it traps planetesimals in its resonances. Those then migrate outwards with the planet, and because of the geometry of the resonances, which you might have noticed from Sam Lawler's talk yesterday, cause clumpy structure, and it could cause clumps that are observable, even if it doesn't in the solar system. The other explanation is that the dust is produced in a recent collision. There's a poster on this by Alan Jackson that I'd encourage you to go and see. He couldn't show this this movie in that, so I can show that here, if it will let me. So the collision happens just here. Debris is thrown off in all directions. The debris stays as a clump for a relatively short time. It's not then that we think we would be witnessing this, but at a much later time, because actually the disk of debris that is created in this collision remains asymmetric for a long time, because all of the debris starts off at a finite, at a small point, and so all the debris goes off on its orbits, gets spreads around, but it all has to go back through the same point. So you always end up with this asymmetry that lasts for about 500,000 years in beta-pic. So we could be, and that is, because that point is very small, it's also got a high collision rate, and that would be where lots of CO would be produced, which would then disappear off around the orbit and then photodissociate before it's had a chance to get around. So that's another possible explanation for clumps. So ALMA is obviously great. It's going to revolutionize our understanding of debris disks as it gets more images. And it's not just imaging in CO. We don't know how many disks will be able to be imaged in CO yet. But in Continuum, it's also doing great things. These are the first images of that ALMA got of debris disks. This shown in orange here is the ALMA observation of Fomalhaut. And it's important to point out that we need ALMA images even if we already have high-resolution images. We already had from Paul Callas these HST images, shown in blue, which showed the structure in very high detail. And the reason is that ALMA, imaging in the millimeter, tells us about the location of millimeter-sized dust, which tells us about the location of the planetesimal belt. In contrast, HST, looking at scattered light, is telling us about small micron-sized dust that is affected by radiation pressure. And the two can have different structures. In this case, it's rather subtle. As you can see, the two look very, very similar here. But if you look at a cross-cut through the disk, then the millimeter emission is more tightly confined than the scattered light that is much that is broader. And what's most interesting about this, I think, is the narrowness of this ring. Why is Fomalhaut's ring so narrow? It's just 16 AU wide out at 130 AU. In Aaron Bowley's paper, he suggested that the ring is not just truncated at the inner edge by a planet, but by a planet at the outer edge as well. And as Paul was telling us, there's a rather confusing dynamical picture that's being built up about Fomalhaut that will be very interesting to follow as it goes on. The explanation of why the millimeter emission is narrower than the optical emission is relatively well understood, at least qualitatively. And that's because of radiation pressure. So if we have a planetesimal belt down here with this thick black line down here, and a planetesimal breaks up here, then the dust that is produced has a different orbit to the planetesimal due to radiation pressure. Big dust, millimeter-sized grains like the ones that we see in the ALMA image, stay on about the same orbit, but the small micron-sized dust, if it's small enough, gets put on a hyperbolic orbit and gets removed on a hyperbolic trajectory straight away. Stuff that's slightly bigger, that's above that blowout limit, remains bound but gets put on these highly elliptical orbits. So you expect to see outside of a planetesimal belt this halo of dust with two components. You've got a bound component and you've got an unbound component as well. And there's been quite a lot of work on collisional modeling of how planetesimals get ground down into dust, what kind of size distribution you expect, what kind of halos you would expect from a bunch of people, many of them in this room. So we know a lot more about these halos now, but I don't think we've really quite closed the loop on understanding them. When Kate Sue imaged Vega, she saw the halo and suggested that if we're seeing the unbound grains in this system, then there's so many of them that implies a high mass loss rate, high enough that this component would have to be stochastic and not a steady state component. That was countered by Sebastian Müller, who said that, well, actually we can explain this halo using a steady state interpretation. In other words, that these are actually bound grains. The problem at the moment is that we haven't got enough observations of halos and enough application of these models to these halos to know what to expect, whether the different diversity in halos, whether there is a diversity in halos, and whether how that relates to the collision physics or something more fundamental about whether some of these components are stochastic or steady states. So I think there's still work to be done on that. And Brenda Matthews has a poster which shows one of the halos of HR 8799 if you want some more information on this. So most of the debris disks that I've been talking about conceptually are just Kuiper belts, or rings of dust, rings of planetesimals that are creating dust. But some systems have multiple debris disks, or multiple components to their debris disks. Kate Sue, I think, is going to talk more about this in one of the next talks. So I just wanted to illustrate this with Eta Corvi. So Eta Corvi has a big Kuiper belt out at 150 AU that's imaged at these longer wavelengths. But when you get to the mid-infrared, you see that the dust is confined to a very small scale, not 150 AU now, but 1.5 AU. So 2 orders of magnitude difference in radius. And this hot dust is causing us a big headache. As Grant Kennedy was telling us a couple of days ago, there's a problem. We want to explain it by analogy with the solar system as a massive asteroid belt. But the problem is, if you stick a massive asteroid belt at 1.5 AU from Eta Corvi and let it collisionally evolve for 1 billion years, it will grind itself away. Collisions are very frequent down very close to the star. So we have to come up with different explanations one of which is comets being scattered in from an outer belt, and I think Jean-Charles is going to talk about this, later on. And Grant talked a bit more about this. I just want to pick up on one point here, which is the possibility that if we look at a young star and see hot dust, then the possibility that we could be observing the ongoing terrestrial planet formation. Because this illustrates another point about debris. So they're not just telling us about the architecture of the planetary systems that they're sitting in, but they also tell us important information about planet formation processes. And that's actually an important constraint that most people who do planet formation seem to be ignoring for now. So take the solar system as the example. We know that the terrestrial planet formation ended at about 50 million years after the solar system formed in the impact that formed the moon. So Alan Jackson had a paper last year that looked at the debris that was created in that impact, the stuff that didn't end up staying bound to the Earth and coalescing to form the moon, the stuff that disappeared off, looked at its dynamical evolution and collisional evolution and asked, what would the solar system have looked like at about this time from this debris? Would it have been detectable? The answer is yes. This is the 24 micron flux you'd expect to see from the disk as a function of age. So this is the solar system. Let's say it was faint, had no dust, no dust, no dust. At 50 million years, there would have been this massive spike from all of the dust that was created from vapor condensates in this impact. That would have gone away relatively quickly in less than about 1,000 years, but the rest of the rubble would remain around and remain bright for about 10 million years, because dynamics don't get rid of this. It ends up, most of it being reaccreted onto the Earth, but dynamically it takes a long time to do that, and collisionally it can remain around for a long time. So in this 100 million year period, the solar system would have been detectable if we were seeing it from outside in about 10% of that time. If it had only one collision. If it had more collisions, it would have been detectable for a larger fraction of that time. The good news is that if you plot the other debris disks that are known on this plot, they're shown as these points, then they have levels of emission that are comparable with what is predicted. So it could be that in some of these systems, we're actually witnessing the aftermath of these events. But the problem, you might remember from Grant's talk, was that in this young bin, these hot excesses are rare. They're only found around 1% of stars. So if a collision is observable for 10% of the time, that means that only 10% of stars can have one of these type of collisions. So that either means that terrestrial planet formation is rare, or it means that, or more sort of fundamentally, I guess, it means that giant impacts that happen after 10 million years have to be rare. So all of the terrestrial planet formation has to have happened early on. Okay, now it would be remiss of me to talk about planets and debris disks and the relation between the two if I didn't acknowledge the fact that back in 2009, when Spitzer did the studies, they found that there was no correlation at all between debris disks and planets. If you look at the luminosities of debris disks around stars that have planets and those that don't have planets, they looked identical. Fortunately, that is now changing. Jeff Bryden has a Herschel survey looking at 99 sun-like stars with radial velocity planets, and now finds that the luminosity distribution is brighter for stars, for disks around stars that have planets than around those that don't have planets. This is something that we actually predicted a few years ago. Basically, the stars that form planets form out of more massive protoplanetary disks, and so they have brighter debris disks. That's one possible explanation. There's another correlation that is coming out as well, and it might explain why there's been a difference in this last few years. In fact, Herschel has been doing great, but it's not all down to Herschel, it's actually down to the planets as well. So I found this out when I was writing up the results on this star. This is 61 Ver. It's a nearby G star. It's got a nice resolved disk in our survey. We've got a debris survey looking at nearby stars looking for debris disks. So we picked this one out. I was writing it up. It's also got 3 Neptune-mass planets orbiting close in. And what I realized is that these planets were only found back in 2010. And the kind of planets that are being found now are these low-mass planetary systems. So I wondered if there was a correlation with low-mass planets that wasn't found by Spitzer. So I just took the nearest 60 G stars and split them into two groups, the ones that had planets that are what I called low-mass, less massive than around Saturn, and the ones that had high-mass planets. The ones that had high-mass planets, none of the 5 of those have got debris disks, but 4 of the 6 that have low-mass planets have got debris disks. These are all noted down here, and the ones in red are the ones that have been discovered since 2010. So you can see that most of these planetary systems weren't known about back in 2009. So our understanding of these correlations is advancing as we learn more about planetary systems and as we learn more about debris. Of course, this is low number statistics for now, but 4 out of 6 compared with 0 out of 5 is certainly suggestive. So before I finish, I want to leave you with one thing. I haven't really talked about surveys, and I feel a bit bad about this because the chair of this conference is the PI of this debris survey, which I'm also involved with. So debris and Dunes have been surveying the nearest stars to the sun, looking for debris disks, and there's some fantastically interesting stuff that I'm not going to tell you about. Not because I don't think it's interesting, but because John T. Marshall will I think, summarize this in his talk on the Dunes survey. The one thing I want to leave you with, though, is this plot. This shows some of a compendium of some of the debris disks that have been detected in the surveys, showing the fractional luminosity against their radius. They all lie about here. I don't want to discuss the details of this plot, but what I want to point out is what they mean for planetary systems and about thinking of them in terms of components of planetary systems, because this radius, if these debris disks are Kuiper belts, then they're telling us the outer extent of the planetary system. This fractional luminosity here scales with the mass that's in the debris disk. And so you can plot these debris disks on a plot like this, which is planet mass against semi-major axis that you will be familiar with. We've got our radial velocity planets down here, the ones that we heard about on Monday, the directly imaged ones up here. And these are where the debris disks would lie, fairly quick and dirty. I only did this very quickly. They're at the right radius, but of course where you scale the fractional luminosity to put it on in terms of mass is a little bit arbitrary. But what I wanted to use this for is not to give you a kind of quantitative comparison, but just to cement in your mind the idea that debris disks are components of planetary systems that are every much as useful and important to understand as these planets down here. And I think I'll just leave you with the conclusions there. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Hi, Mark. That was lovely. Thank you. So I have a question about this extrapolation from the moon formation. So that's one type of impact. So have you? Maybe I might have misunderstood. It's very possible. Are you extrapolating the amount of dust from that one type of impact to make your conclusion that terrestrial planet formation must be done in 10 million years?
Yeah, we're taking that one impact that people have studied in detail and took what happens to the debris from that impact and said that debris would last for 10 million years, would be bright for 10 million years. Of course, there's a whole range of impacts, so what we really need to do is to study terrestrial planet formation models and to look at all the different types of impacts that we expect to see how bright we'd expect the systems to be. Because it seems to me that that's just one impact. And maybe it produced a lot of debris compared to other ones, but you have the hit and run that produce lots of debris as well. So perhaps systems are brighter on average for even longer than 10 million years out, if those models are correct.
Brenda?
Hi, Mark. There's been some recent work on the role of debris disks in stabilizing planetary systems, so they're dynamically important to the stabilization of the system. Do you want to comment on that? You didn't talk about it, but...
Yeah, so the debris disks that we see are typically, when you look at the dust mass, are quite small, less than an Earth mass, more like a moon mass. But they imply that there have to be lots of planetesimals feeding them, and actually their mass, which is why I put them on that last plot, at around a few Earth mass, is around a few Earth mass. You need to have a few, maybe 10 Earth mass in debris in these systems, and then they can be important for the stability and lead to migration of Neptune-sized planets. They basically become important for planets that are around the mass of the debris disk. So yes, they can be important.
Stan? So you mentioned debris disks tend to be constrained to rings. They do have certain radial extent. I was wondering if the more massive debris disks could actually have some non-negligible radial optical depth. I was playing around with the radiative transfer code a few years ago, looking at AU-MIC and beta-PIC, and it looked like their optical depth along the midplane actually could be more than 1. So in this context, I'm not sure that's actually true or not. The model is very much, the calculation is model dependent, but I was wondering if that might actually bear relevance to the survival of CO in the beta-PIC disk.
Yeah, it would be interesting if it was. It obviously depends. So there isn't very much. The fractional luminosity is whatever it is, 10 to the minus 3 of order. So if you need it, if you want it to be optically thick, then it has to be of order 10 to the minus 3 or thereabouts, in terms of scale height. So as long as it's thin enough, then it can always be optically thick. I'm not sure what there are constraints on the on the scale height of these disks.
Well, so with AU-MIC we have some, I guess. That's a very thin.
Yeah, I mean, they are very thin, but that's very thin. That's 10 to the minus 3. So.
Chris.
Thanks for the nice review, Mark. When you were discussing Fulmahut, you showed that the full width half max at millimeter wavelengths is narrower than at visible wavelengths. But you really only justified the outer edge being broader with your discussion of the halo. What about the inner edge? Is that due to dust leaking inward? What is that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked at that in detail. I mean, qualitatively, I understand it going out. Yeah, coming in, it could come in by PR drag, but that's not likely to be that important. Yeah, it could be. I mean, just the dynamics of these small grains can lead them to depart from the millimeter grains. I haven't got a definitive answer for you on why it leaks inwards.
Sasha.
Hi Mark, great talk. I just have a short question about CO in beta-PIC. If that CO was produced by, say, a major breakup or something like this, what the mass of the colliding bodies had to be to produce the observed amount of CO? I'm sure you made a short estimate, right?
Yeah, the estimate doesn't actually come from the CO because what you get from the CO is a mass loss rate. So then you have to assume how long it's been colliding, how long it's been produced for. The better estimate of the mass comes from the continuum image, which I didn't show you. So there's the continuum image also shows an asymmetry, also shows the clump, and you've got a better handle on what the mass is in that case. And the answer is you need at least a moon mass in terms of millimeter-sized dust to produce that, and if you scale it up, because that's not going to be everything, you need something like a Mars-sized thing to be broken up to explain it. Big impact if that's the explanation.
One more.
Hi Mark, great talk. I just have a question related again to your catastrophic impacts being able to produce clumps like in beta-PIC. The timescale you're estimating with Alan's simulation is assuming that your object explodes in vacuum. There is not a debris disk with which these debris could interact or collide. So wouldn't you expect, like in beta-PIC, that this object to explode in an already dense disk and have collisions with this disk so that the effect of the collision will fade much faster than what you would expect in full vacuum, as in your simulation, I think?
It's not it's not that it collisionally depletes. That's not what we're worried about. I think you can keep it around for long enough, and how it relates to the background disk is just, you can just constrain that observationally. The constraint on how fast it disappears is actually dynamical, because the clump starts processing. So it only remains as an asymmetry where all the material goes back through this fixed point for a certain number of time, and it's about 1,000 orbits. And within 1,000 orbits, it hasn't all collided, at least not all the big dust. All the small stuff will have collided, but it's still being reproduced by the breakup of bigger fragments in the collision. So it can last for a long time collisionally, but as an asymmetry, it takes a long. It disappears much faster.
Okay, we have to move on. Let's thank Mark again.